Now I'm most depressed and sad, when I once was blithe and glad. I could trip around the town both trim and neatly. I was happy night and morn, but of all such joys I'm shorn, since I fell so deep in love with Sally Wheatley. And oh dear me, what am I gonna do? Sally's taken my heart away completely, and I'll never get it back, 'cause she danced with Mr. Black, and they say he's gone to marry Sally Wheatley. Presents Ghost in the Museum. Episode 11. Sally Wheatley. Ben had no memories of his father. Oliver had died a few months before he was born, and growing up, all he had ever been to him was the stories his Uncle Jake told him, a picture on a wall, the screensaver on his mother's laptop, half glimpsed before she'd close it shut with undue haste and chivvy him away. It was only now as an adult, and some 20 years removed from the accident, that Ben had begun to consider what a torment his childhood must have been to his mother, to see him grow into the image of her dead husband, for her to look at him each day and see the face again that she had last seen on a mortician's slab. It must have been like a haunting, and his leaving Hexham to study at the University of Newcastle a kind of exorcism where the fleeing spirit was all the family she had left in the world. The stresses of being a single mother and maintaining a farm all at once left him in awe at her reserves of willpower. It was a credit to the woman Rose was that Ben had so few unhappy moments growing up, at least none that he could remember. He had loved Sunnyside Farm. The name had been appropriate. The fields of wheat and barley had always seemed to glow in the golden light of a never-ending summer, the blue skies stretching out endlessly as he and his friends rode their bikes in those happy afternoons after school. The world didn't seem to glow so brightly now, and Ben couldn't decide whether it was climate change or the rose-tinted nostalgia for a youth his mother had laboured hard to make carefree. Life was busier now, of course. He and his fiancée lived in the city, where the sky seemed so much further away. His childhood fascination with the fragments of Hadrian's Wall at nearby Corbridge had led seamlessly to his career as an archaeologist at the Great North Museum in Hancock. He worked on buildings for the most part. The city was on the up, or being gentrified depending on the view you took, and there were always Victorian tenements being torn up and redeveloped, always a clutch of old newspapers stuffed into crevices to be found, a workman's boot left incongruously under a floorboard. He had even found a diary once, the juvenile cursive of a long-dead schoolgirl, that had fallen behind the back of a radiator. Ben had always wondered why she had never missed it. That was where the fascination lay, Ben reasoned to himself, as he pulled up the long drive of Sunnyside, the wheat field swaying as he approached, as if bowing in greeting. It was incredible what could be forgotten about, fragments of the past left to rot undisturbed and unnoticed under the noses of the living world. Soon enough, the house came into view, and Ben found it hard to suppress the smile as he took in the jolly red bricks and creeping green ivy of his childhood home. It was much like he remembered it. Coming back to visit his mother always felt like stepping back into a memory, so unchanged was it from his youth. There were the white chickens milling aimlessly in front of the larder door. There was the untidy pile of logs stacked up under the flower boxes spilling out from the windows, all of which had been thrown open invitingly. He knew that he owed his career in archaeology to the house. From an early age, his mother had told him stories of her grandfather, who had rebuilt it from a ruined cottage when he had bought Sunnyside just before the war. It still quietly thrilled Ben to pass by the worn sandstone block lodged haphazardly in the side of the house, the faded words AD 1629 still just visible under his fingertips. The smile faltered somewhat as he drew closer, coming over the small hump on the approach to the house, as the long thin line of pylons poked out from atop the swaying fields. They had been there as long as he could remember too, just as much as the chickens, but they had never sat right for him. As a boy, they had seemed oddities in the rural landscape, the great metal girders rising outstretched from the acres of fields like robotic scarecrows. Ben could still recall vividly a nightmare he'd had when he was 9 years old, that the pylons had come to life and were lumbering slowly over the lip of the fields towards the house, towards his bedroom window that overlooked the vast expanse of the countryside, wiry fingers sparking as they reached through to grab him. His mother had soothed him, and once he had sufficiently calmed down, scolded him for staying up late to watch Jason and the Argonauts, which is clearly where the horrid notion had come from. These days it was easy enough for Ben to reason his dislike away. They spoiled what was otherwise a splendid view, he thought, as he swung the car into the driveway outside the house. There was always that barely audible electrostatic hum that surrounded them too, that had always put his hackles up. He remembered talking to a fellow archaeologist at the museum about how that sort of thing was to blame for most ghost sightings. "It's called infrasound," she had confidently declared to him, as they were working on a particularly dismal old wreck of a building that couldn't have looked more haunted if it had tried. "Low-level vibrations, electric charges, things like that. Does funny things to the brain, can make you feel things are in the room with you when they're not there." The door of the house opened, and the smile was restored to Ben's face as he saw Rose stood on the doorstep. She, too, was just how she had always appeared to him, greying auburn hair tied up in a no-nonsense bandana, dungarees and rolled-up sleeves, wearing a sensible set of Wellington boots flecked with mud. 2 of her 3 dogs were sat panting happily at her feet, the third and youngest already bounding its way over to Ben as he exited the car with his overnight bag. "Benji!" she called out happily, waving to him. "Safe drive, pet." "I made it, didn't I?" Ben replied with a grin, as he knelt down to fuss the delighted Labrador as it rolled onto its back. It was one of those private jokes he and his mother shared. Soon enough, Rose had fussed him inside, and he was sat at the old round wooden table that had seemed so large and tall to him once. His mother was, as usual, surrounded by an air of cheerful chaos as she busied herself with a dozen projects at once. She was knocking through the wall between the kitchen and the dining room, and a set of tall metal stilts were currently holding the sagging wood beam ceiling in place. Ben wondered where she still got her energy from after all these years. "So, how are things?" she chirped, setting down the mismatched mugs of tea as she sat down at the table. "What's Rani up to this weekend?" Ben laughed. "With her folks too, believe it or not. Her granddad's over from Lahore. She hasn't seen him since she was little." "Oh, that is lovely," Rose beamed, her face creasing genially. "It must be hard, not getting to see your family as often as we do. Not sure I'd cope well with that at all." Ben reached out a hand and gave his mother a reassuring pat. "We don't have to find out," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Rose smiled again, but Ben could always see the shreds of pain that always hid beneath. He knew why now, of course. She had every reason to believe that her husband wasn't going anywhere either, before the accident. The accident. Always the one and only. Of course, Ben wasn't there. He hadn't even been born. But it was the accident that had loomed over his entire childhood, a vast incongruous shadow spilling out across the fields and blotting out the sun. His mother had been so careful to shield him from it. Ben hadn't understood why he'd stopped seeing his fun Uncle Jake all of a sudden, but looking back now, it was clear that Rose had dreaded him oversharing to his nephew, passing on the horror of the whole terrible event when all it would achieve would be to traumatise a young child. Uncle Jake was the only person who had seen it happen, and he had never recovered from it. Ben shoved the dark thoughts away. He never wanted his mother to know that what had happened troubled him. She would only worry, and she did enough of that by herself. "Anyway," he smiled, leaning back, "what's new with you? Still not called in a builder?" Rose laughed, gesturing to the deconstructed wall. "Well, I've started now. I might as well finish. This place is hardly swimming in cash, so hardly going to blow this year's seed budget on getting someone else in. Besides, they'd only do it wrong, and then I'd have to fix it anyway." "Well, you're not wrong there," Ben laughed. "Never something you couldn't improve, is there, Mum?" "Smart boy," said Rose, cocking an eyebrow. "You know me so well." Ben looked more closely at the demolished wall. His training couldn't help but kick in as he took in the layers of exposed materials Rose had ripped apart. Wallpaper and plasterboard gave way to crumbling red bricks, fraying wood, and at its deepest points what looked like wattle and daub mulch, so fragile he reckoned it would crumble to the touch. "Speaking of smart," Rose said, her face suddenly alert, "I was wondering if I could pick that big brain of yours, Benji." Ben was faintly surprised. His mother almost never asked for help. Even all these years later, she still found it hard to shake the role of sole carer that had defined her. "Of course," he said openly. "What's up?" Rose had that face on, that conspiratorial grin that she had often shared with him when he was little, and she had indulged him with a special treat just between the two of them. "I found something that's right up your street. In the wall." She got up from the table, disappearing for a moment behind the wall. She crouched down, and Ben craned his neck as he heard her rustling with something. "Got a fair idea what it is," she said breezily. "But I know how much you go crazy for this sort of thing, so I thought you'd like a look first." Rose re-emerged back into the kitchen, and in her arms, swaddled like a baby, was what looked like a small bundle of rags. That puzzled Ben for a moment. He had half expected a yellowed newspaper or an old rag doll lost in the foundations from his great-grandfather's day. "Oh, what have you got there?" he asked, curious. Rose said nothing but set down the small package on the table between the mugs of tea. Slowly, she pulled back the filthy wrappings to reveal what was inside. For a moment, Ben thought he was looking at an unremarkable lump of coal. The small black mass so twisted and desiccated that it could only have been mineral. But the longer he looked, the more dreadful the thing became. It was the legs first. Dried skin stretched paper thin over long bones. Arms contorted around the legs. The muscles frozen taut in the death throes. Then it was the head. The wiry, needle-sharp whiskers. The mouth pulled back in a sharp-toothed snarl of agony. Twisting around the protruding ribs, a few mangy patches of fur clung to the skeletal tail of the mummified cat. He had seen things just like it before. Husks of rats and mice that had died beneath floorboards and shriveled away. But there was something so awful about the way the cat looked as though it had writhed and twisted in its last moments. And somewhere in the depths of his mind Ben could hear the plaintive, pitiful meow of the cat, barely audible within the walls as it had starved to death. The two old dogs whined and crouched low on the stone floor. He recoiled, starting back and out of his chair with such a speed that Rose's face fell. "Oh," she said, and hurriedly covered the cat back up. "Sorry, Benj, should have warned you." Ben shook his head. No, don't worry, Mum," he said hurriedly. "Just wasn't expecting to see that at the dinner table." He smiled, trying his best not to give away that his heart was still thumping. That seemed to satisfy Rose, though she still regarded the shape of the cat with a renewed wariness. "I wasn't expecting to find it in the walls," she proclaimed. "Found it yesterday, as I was taking down the middle bit. Knocked through the brickwork and found the wooden bits, which was a surprise, since I always thought Grandad had rebuilt this bit of the house from scratch. There was this great big black hole, and I reached into it to clear out the rubble, and, well..." She gestured broadly at the shape of the cat. Ben approached the table again, poking at the wrappings with the handle of his teaspoon. "And you found it wrapped up in this?" he asked, puzzled. Rose nodded. "There was a rope too, tied around the top. Fell apart as soon as I pulled it out. Thing was so old. God, you think you jumped when you saw it. Imagine how far I went back when it flopped open. The smell was bad enough. Had to open all the windows. Still hasn't gotten rid of the stink." Ben looked around. He had barely clocked it when he had driven up to the house, but now that his mother had mentioned it, every window in the kitchen was open, a warm breeze filtering through the house. It was still there though, just as she said. A faint, musty tang that hung heavy in the air. He knew that smell from the houses he dug through, the unmistakable stench of something that had crawled under the floor and died. It must have been in the walls before Great-Grandad rebuilt the house, Ben wondered, looking up at the wood beam ceiling. Maybe since 1629. Rose looked excited again. Oh wow! Always wanted to find something from back then. All you've ever had until now was that old block outside with the date. Poor thing though. Wonder how it managed to get stuck inside the walls. Don't think poor Puss had much of a say in it, Ben said idly, as he continued to prod exploratorily with the spoon. It was put there. The sack was tied up. If this is from when the house was built, it'll be a witch charm. The yelp that Ben heard was one that he had never known his mother to make. He looked up sharply. That was a leftover of his childhood too. He had always been afraid that he would lose her just as suddenly as he had his father. Rose was stood stock still, staring at the cat with wide eyes. All the blood seemed to drain from her face. Her eyes met Ben, and the worry and concern flashing within them immediately set his teeth on edge. His mother had always put on a brave face in front of him, never giving away when she was upset or afraid. The fear etched on her face was alien. A witch charm? She gulped, eyes fixed on the cat. Ben nodded, unsure of how to address her sudden change of demeanour. Yeah, he started. People used to put cats in walls when they built new buildings back in the 17th century. It's a kind of folk magic. They thought it would ward off witchcraft, evil spirits, things like that. Rose continued to stare at the cat for a long time. Ben could see her bite her lip, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her dungarees. That was a nervous tic of hers. She never wanted him to see her clenching and unclenching her fists with uncertainty. Poor thing, she said quietly, though Ben doubted very much that the fate of the cat was what had disturbed her. Rose was ashen-faced as she gently picked up the mass of filthy rags and deposited the cat back behind the wall where she had retrieved it. The following hours passed quietly enough as the pair of them made great efforts to steer the conversation back to work and gossip and favoured memories. Are you still seeing Jake this afternoon? Rose asked with an air of lightness that seemed slightly forced. Ben nodded. It's been a while, but if you're not comfortable with it. Rose shook her head. No, you're your own man, Benj, and he's your uncle. It's been a while anyway. Not sure who's checking up on him much these days. The musty smell had somehow gotten heavier as Ben finished his tea, and the young Labrador was pacing about the kitchen rapidly, whinging and sniffing urgently. I'll be back in a few hours, Ben said reassuringly. You need anything else bringing in? Rose confirmed that she was fine, all fine, and waved him away. It wasn't odd to Ben that she waved him off as he drove down the dirt track. His mother always did that, surely she waved to him as he pulled up. But he swore he could see her face fall before she disappeared behind the crest of the hill. Shouldn't have taken it out, Rose finally muttered as her son drove out of sight. She'll know that I took it out. The nature of his mother and his uncle's falling out still wasn't entirely clear to Ben, even at this age. In his earliest years, Jake had been like an ersatz father to him, the man who carried him on his shoulders, played and roughhoused with him on the farm. He had always been the one Ben had felt able to share his worries and concerns that he hadn't wanted to encumber his mother with. But around the time he was 15, appearances at Sunnyside had suddenly begun to dwindle rapidly and diminish. There had been some sort of a row. He had never found out the details, had hidden upstairs the night it had happened, lurked under his covers and focused intently on some history book to try and ignore the raised voices. Jake hadn't been exiled from the farm, nothing so dramatic, but ever since then there had been a definite coolness and a distance kept between him and Rose. It had taken some time for Ben to tentatively get back in contact with his uncle while he was at university, responding when Jake had reached out with the kind of desperately jolly messages he felt he couldn't refuse without breaking his heart. They had gotten over the initial awkwardness that comes when a man finds that the boy whose hair he used to tussle was suddenly a fellow adult who could look him in the eye, and now they saw each other as much as they could. That was why Ben was now stood outside the unassuming block of yellow brick flats on the Giles Gate. He looked down the street towards the handsome market square of Hexham that had always seemed like such a busy place when he and his mother had travelled up from the farm to the town. The square bulk of Hexham Abbey loomed over the more modern buildings, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. The front door opened and Jake appeared before him with a toothy grin. "Ben, my lad," he smiled, pulling his nephew into a hug. "It's good to see you." Ben soon found himself ushered into the front room. It was a marked study in contrast to his mother's kitchen. Whereas that was light and airy, the flat was dark and cluttered, heavy leather furniture that sucked you in like quicksand when you sat on it. The same faded and creased posters of rock bands from the 70s and 80s were tacked haphazardly onto the walls. There was something of the eternal adolescent about him, in his interests, his perpetual singledom. Ben felt that Jake had never quite outgrown his teenage years. He always wondered if the accident was at the fault for that. "How's work at your museum?" Jake asked with his air of enforced jollity. "Made the great discovery of the century yet, mate?" Ben smiled and rolled his eyes. "No golden idols yet, Jake, no." He still wasn't sure that Jake actually knew what he did for a living, but from his line of questioning it seemed he was still labouring under the pretence that his nephew was a kind of tomb raider. "You're more likely to find me dusting a rusted old spoon down in the museum lab. Not had to flee from any booby-trapped temples yet." Jake laughed at that, his over-loud, slightly forced laugh that Ben always thought insisted upon itself a little too much to be believable, and leaned back in his sagging armchair. A frown spread across his face as he took in Ben before him. "What's up?" he asked, leaning forward. "You look a little down in the dumps, lad." Ben shifted uncomfortably. It never felt appropriate to bring up difficult feelings with Jake. It would feel far too much like kicking a puppy. "Oh, I'm alright," he said, not meeting Jake in the eye. Well, something weird happened at Mum's earlier today." "Oh?" Jake said, looking slightly put out. Is she alright?" Ben could see the hesitation in Jake's face at the mention of Rose, the reserves of hurt in his eyes at being cast out. He chose his next words carefully. That imagined, snarling, raging mule of the cat in the walls still danced at the edges of his mind. "Oh, she's fine," he began, still busying about with the renovations. "You should see it, got scaffolding in the kitchen and everything. Except, well, she found something in the walls, showed me it. A cat, a dead cat. Been in there for years." Jake's face went pale, his eyes wide. It was that face, the same face his mother had pulled when he had told her about the witch charm. "A cat?" he said, his voice quiet. Ben leaned forward, his heart racing. "What is it?" he asked, puzzled. "Mum pulled exactly that face when I told her it was a witch charm. What do you two both know that I don't?" Jake looked ashen, staring down at the floor. He rubbed his chin, concern and worry etched in his eyes. Ben had seen that look before, at least. It was the look Jake usually got when he talked about the past, when he talked about his brother, Oliver, when he talked about the accident. "Jake?" Ben asked, and that made his uncle look up, unsure and uncomfortable to be addressed without his affix of uncle. I know that you and Mum, she didn't like it or wasn't comfortable when you would talk about Dad. What happened to Dad?" Jake looked down again, and Ben could see he still visibly winced at the memory. "But I'm not a kid anymore," Ben continued, more firmly. "I know what happened to him, what you saw. I'm sorry that you had to see it. But if there's something else, anything else that you or Mum didn't tell me." Jake slowly raised his head to look his nephew in the face. He had hollow, haunted eyes, welling with emotion. He bit his lip. "It's not that," he began, slowly and in a pained tone. "Everything that happened that day, it's not that, I promise, but..." He pulled back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. There was an exposed wire up there, hanging limp and connecting to the bare, swinging light bulb. "But," Jake continued, with a resigned sigh, "there is something your mother, Rose, the two of us, together, we decided, right after you were born, that we didn't want you to know, for your own sake as much as ours." Ben's heart felt like it was tearing out of his chest. 1,000 thoughts were spilling around in his mind. What was it that had been kept from him? The idea that he might be on the precipice of some hitherto unknown details about his father, something that could throw his whole conception of himself off its axis, was terrifying as it was alluring. He felt the kind of anxiety that came when you were confronted by an unexpected diagnosis, the sudden call at the end of the phone at the death of a relative. "Please," Ben asked, heated, "whatever it is, I need to know, Uncle Jake. What is it about a mummified cat that scares you both so much? It's not like it's witchcraft." The look that Jake gave back in reply to that made Ben's stomach clench up. He became aware in the quiet moment that followed of a low-level electric hum. It must have been from the wire overhead, the rational part of his mind thought, though it still set his teeth on edge. "Infrasound again," he thought to himself. Jake leant back in his chair and looked out to the single, narrow window in the lounge. The sky was just beginning to redden as the sun dipped towards the steeple of Hexham Abbey, glimpsed tantalisingly between the crowd of modern buildings. "A long time ago," Jake started, "me and Ollie, your dad, we lived not far from Sunnyside, where your mum was. We both knew Rose from school, all played together in the fields, just like you and your friends did." That wasn't a particular revelation to Ben. He knew that his parents had been childhood sweethearts. It had done Rose good, he thought, when she had recalled the first fumbled steps the pair of them had made towards each other in their last years of secondary school, told to him when he had been racked with prepubescent angst over his first girlfriend. There had been a bittersweet tinge in her voice, he recognised now, a smile at a happy moment long gone. "Rose's mum, your grandma, she was gone by this point," Jake continued, "and her dad was sick. She had to care for him, didn't get to spend a lot of time with other kids. Me and Ollie felt sorry for her. That's why we started cycling over to play with her. Then her dad died in 75. She were only 10. Ben felt such a twinge for his mother. He had only ever known his grandparents through pictures and stories just as much as his father. There were times growing up that half his family had felt imaginary. He could hardly comprehend how Rose had been able to hold it together after a life so full of loss, of having to put her own needs and wants aside to care for others. Jake rubbed his hands. Her grandparents raised her after that, but they were busy running the farm. We had her over at our parents' place all the time, making sure she was eating. Before long she was staying over. Her and Ollie always stayed up to watch Doctor Who, the Tom Baker ones, you know. Dad got her a bike for her 11th birthday so she could ride with us. We were a proper little gang, us three. Ben smiled, just slightly. I remember Grandma and Grandpa's. That was just like how they looked after me when I was little. Jake smiled back, but it was a wistful one. He had tears in his eyes. I miss them, Ben. Mum, Dad, Ollie. I'm the only one left. I don't like being the only one left. Tentatively, Ben reached out to clasp Jake's quivering hands. I'm here. I won't forget. I promise, Uncle Jake. Jake took a ragged, uneven breath, his smile falling away. He looked at his nephew with a desolate expression. You're like him. he said. "Ollie, I know I always say that, and I'm sorry if Rose thought that I was, God, I don't know, trying to get him back through you. That's not what I meant. You're your own person, Ben lad, but all the good bits of your dad, you got them, and, well, that's why we didn't want to tell you. We didn't want to ruin all that, just like it ruined him." Ben was thoroughly perplexed now. "What do you mean? Jake, what the hell happened?" It was Jake's turn to clasp Ben's hands. He looked at him dead in the eyes. "Your mother always told you, didn't she? Not to go in the farthest field at Sunnyside, on the border with Linnell's farm." Ben could feel the room around him fall away, the already dark walls descend into shadow. There it was, crawling out of the crevices of his brain, that one slither of blackness amid all the golden rays of sunshine blasting off his childhood memories like a corona. "Sally Black," Ben whispered. He could picture the field in his mind's eye, clear and crisp, only ever glimpsed from behind the tumble-down wooden fence overgrown with thorns that separated it from his happy childhood world. It hadn't been simply forbidden. That would have been too enticing to an adventurous-minded boy of his age. It would have been too tempting to jump the fence, to thumb his nose at his overprotective mother. Sally Black had been cursed ground. It was where the accident had happened, at the far end of the field, where the great iron pylon that had stalked his nightmares stood. That was where his father had died. Jake bowed his head. "We never wanted you to go there, nowhere near it. Not just because that's where it happened, but because of what happened there before." Ben was breathing heavily. The field swam before him in his mind, so glowing and golden and untrodden, the pylon snarling and mewling in the distance. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "What happened there before?" All the good cheer and rambunctiousness had long since drained from Jake's face. He looked nervously out at the window again. Hexham Abbey was dissolving into shadow, its details lost to the encroaching darkness. "It was the summer of 1976, he began. "The great heat wave. God, what a summer. We had the time of our lives, me and Ollie and Rose and all of our other mates. It seemed to stretch on forever, one long adventure that never ended. Sunnyside was never prettier. The sky was never so big. And we were all so grown up, or we thought we were. Stupid kids. 11, 12 years old. I was only 7. Would have followed Ollie anywhere. And it was the 70s. Our parents kicked us out in the morning and expected us to entertain ourselves while they got on with running the farm. Ollie had to look after me and, well, he wasn't going anywhere without Rose, even then." Jake leaned back in his chair, and Ben thought he looked suddenly much more his own age, his face falling and hangdog. "We'd run out of games," he continued, running his hands through his greying blonde hair. "There's only so many times you can play Daleks. We'd already gone swimming in Devil's Water. God, Ollie got such a smack for that. It was August, and we were going back to school the next week. And that's when Ollie says, 'I know what we can do. I know where we can go. Let's go and take a look around Sally Black. Let's go and find the witch.'" The room was suddenly completely still. Ben looked at Jake with staring, frightened eyes. He thought of Rani, and suddenly he wanted to be far, far away from Hexham, away from Sunnyside, back home with the woman he loved, in the glass and metal tangle of Newcastle, where the sky didn't stretch so impossibly wide, the ground soar off into the horizon forever. "The witch?" he asked quietly. What witch? There was a look of deadly seriousness on Jake's face that was as alien to Ben as the look of fear on his mother's had been. He could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead, an involuntary twitch above his left temple. "The kids don't talk about her now," Jake whispered. "Kids don't talk about anything now. No scary stories, local legends. Smartphones, TikTok, it's all kryptonite to ghosts and monsters. But they were real to us, Ben, my lad. They lived in all the little nooks and crannies, all the secret dens and lumps and bumps in the landscape. We believed in them all, knew that they'd gobble us up if we stayed out too late, or said the magic words 5 times by the old pond or in the mirror. We believed in them, and we believed in Sally Wheatley." Jake grimaced, as if saying that name was like swallowing sick. He had a furtive, hunted look about him, as if he were half expecting something to jump out at him from the encroaching shadows in the corners of the flat. "Sally Wheatley," Ben said in a low voice. "Sally, is that why that field is called that?" He had always wondered how the fields at Sunnyside had gotten their names. Hawkstone, Millbrow, Williamson. Sally Black had always stood out, but he had never dared to ask his mother, never wanted her to fret that he was even thinking about going near the place. "It might be. It was our local legend. Think every farming place has the same one with different names. Screeching Ginny, Scratching Fanny, Fine Jane. Ours was Sally Wheatley. God, I remember Ollie telling me the story for the first time. It scared the shit out of me. I didn't sleep for ages. He always pushed things too far. Always." There was a bitterness in Jake's tone that Ben had never heard there before when he spoke about his brother. Jake had hero-worshipped Oliver. That much was clear from the reverence with which he had always preserved his memory for Ben. Whatever had happened, Ben thought, the memory of it seemed to twist the people closest to him into unnatural shapes, like a bewitchment. "The story went like this," Jake said hurriedly. "Years ago, no one ever seemed to know when, Sally Wheatley was the prettiest girl in Hexham. The way Jake told it to me, she was a farmer's daughter. I heard another version from Brian Pratt in the year above me at school, that she was the bar lady at the Coach and Horses. All the lads in Hexham those days had their eye on Sally, and no more so than the miller's son. One day, and it was always a dark, rainy day in all the versions of the story I was told, there was a dance on at the village hall, and Sally, she danced with Mr. Black, the squire's son. That was scandal enough for a country gentleman to gad about with a common girl like Sally. Before anyone knew it though, they were engaged, and within the year, Sally Wheatley was Sally Black, and she was going to be the lady of the manor one day. The miller's son, well, he were broken-hearted over it. Went all over Hexham bewailing that it should have been him, that he would never love anyone else but Sally, that all the joy had gone out of his life. No one ever took him seriously. But then he hung himself, that miller's son, from a tree in a far-off field, over by Devil's Water. They didn't find him for days. That's what Ollie said. And when they did, it was because of all the flies that had swarmed around him as he went rotten in the sun. Ben could see it. His father as a boy, taking the perverse joy older brothers get from terrorising their wide-eyed younger siblings with scary stories. It was an experience he had never had. He had so wished for a brother or a sister, anyone to talk to on lonely nights at Sunnyside. The taint of Sally Wheatley was spreading like black ink across the happy span of his memories, polluting all that cheer. And now doubt was beginning to chew at the edges that he was ever happy at all. It was like all the sunshine was being leached from his soul, like it had from the miller's son. The miller and his wife were devastated, of course, Jake continued, and angry. They went about the town just as their son had, but they were saying that Sally Wheatley had put a hex on him. Had put a hex on Mr. Black to make him fall in love with her. They put about that pretty Sally was a witch, and whenever this is all meant to have happened long, long ago, saying something like that about a woman never ended well. The rumours, they got out of control, and just then, at the worst possible time, the witch finders came into Hexham, down from Scotland, and the villagers dragged poor Sally Wheatley out of the manor, kicking and screaming, her fingers worn down to bloody stumps from her clinging onto the doorframe. They found her guilty of witchcraft, and strung her up in the same field where the miller's son had hung himself, and that field ever after was called Sally Black. And the very last thing that Sally said, the story went, was to curse that place, that anyone who came near it would surely die there, just as she and the miller's son had done. That was what the kids in Hexham said when we were little. If you went into that field, Sally Wheatley would get you. Maybe not right away, maybe not for 10 years or more, but one day she would get you and kill you stone dead, and the last thing that you'd hear before you died would be her cackling as she dragged you down to hell. Ben was quiet. He suddenly felt very small and very young again, and the world a very dark and scary place. Your dad did the witch's laugh. Jake finished with a hollow chuckle. That was what made me cry. It was horrible. Mum smacked him for that too and told him not to be such a nasty little creep. It was almost dark now outside, the sky going from glowing orange to dark, seething red. Jake slowly reached over and flicked on a lamp. Huge, looming shadows were now cast onto the posted walls of the flat. Ben knew that he should have left a while ago, knew that his mother would be waiting for him, doubtless pacing about the kitchen, her eyes flicking back and forth to the dead cat in its filthy wrappings. The will to rise from his chair and leave had deserted him. "Is that what happened?" he asked, staring at the dark shadows spilling out from where they were sat, the form of Sally Wheatley hanging from her branch materialising in every corner. "Is that what scared you and Mum so much?" Jake buried his head in his hands. "He always took it too far," he muttered. "Always had to show how brave he was." Ben felt his stomach clench again. He knew now what his father had done. "You all went to Sally Black. Dad took you to find the witch there." Jake nodded. "I can still remember it so clearly. We rode our bikes all the way to the edge of Sunnyside, to that field. Rose's granddad had always told us to steer clear of Sally Black, said it was dangerous, overgrown and all full of nettles. But Ollie didn't care. He propped up his back against the fence and hopped over just like that. Rose told him he was being stupid, that there was no such thing as witches. I agreed with her. I said, yeah, no such thing. But I mustn't have looked that way on my face, as Ollie just grinned at me and was like, "What are you, scared, Jake?" And I could never admit that to him, never. So I let him pull me over. And Rose, of course, she had to follow. I was scared at first, but then after a few minutes I started to feel real stupid. It was just a boring field, full of wild grasses, an old scarecrow strung up in the middle, rusty ploughs just dumped there. Looked like no one had been there for years and years. It was waste ground. Ollie was still making a great show of being all big and brave. "Are you there, Sally Wheatley?" he was calling out at the sky. "Where are you, Sally Wheatley? I'm in your field. I'm stomping on your grass. Why don't you come out and stop me? Nah. Jake shivered. He was hunched in his chair, his eyes hollow and distant. Ben wasn't sure what to think. Everyone had times. They had acted the fool when they were kids. He knew he had given his mother her fair share of shocks when he was young. But his father's taunting of his little brother seemed particularly mean-spirited, and so out of keeping with the man he had been told he had grown into. Ben wondered if that was why Rose had always been so hurt and tearful whenever he had snuck out into the fields after dark, had disappeared for a few hours and then been so crestfallen to see how upset he'd made his mother. What had happened in that field in Sally Black half a century ago to strike so much terror into her heart? "Uncle Jake," Ben whispered. "What happened? Please just tell me." Jake's face was cast in shadow, his gaze distant. He let out a low, rumbling sigh and clenched his eyes shut as hard as he could. Nothing happened. No witch, no blood-curdling shriek, and Ollie just laughed. "See?" he said. "It's all just made up." Soon, all three of us were in on it, and we all just ran around that field, kicking at tufts and ripping at plants, all calling out at the sky. "Sally Wheatley, what a joke! You don't scare us, Sally Wheatley!" It felt so good, Ben, like I had power over her, could shove her aside like an old forgotten nightmare. That was the last time I ever felt like that. Jake rose to his feet, slowly, painfully, until he was stood at his full height. Ben was mesmerised, glued to his chair like an astronaut at takeoff. Jake's shadow grew and grew until it seemed to swallow the whole back wall of the flat. He stretched out his arms. His eyes were full of despair and dread. Ollie went over to the Scarecrow, that old Scarecrow in the middle of Sally Black. It was so old, looked like it would fall apart if you tugged at it. It was dressed all in rags, filthy brown rags that looked all rotten and crumbly, and it was wrapped up in all this rope, tied so tight to the stick. It had long, twisted fingers sticking out from its arms, and its head, it was twisted to one side, and it was wrapped up in a burlap sack. And the eyes and the mouth, they were just a couple of thick stitches in the sack. I thought it was creepy, and I got scared again, and Ollie said, "Oh, what are you scared of now, Jake? It's just a stupid old Scarecrow." And he started tugging and pulling at it, waving its arms about. "Oh, I'm gonna get you, Jake. I'm gonna hop off my perch and I'm gonna get you." I started crying, and Rose properly snapped at him, told him to leave me alone. Ollie was annoyed, said he was just fooling around and not to get so touchy. He used one of the Scarecrow's arms to point at her, and he must have done it too fast because it tore off and he fell flat on his face into the grass. Jake snapped his arms to his side and collapsed back into his chair with a thump that made Ben jump out of his skin. He was breathing heavily now. He wanted out, to get back to Sunnyside and then to make an excuse, any excuse to go back to Newcastle and never look back. Rose was chewing him out. "Tell him it serves him right for being so horrid," Jake breathed. Ollie didn't answer, he just lay there, on the ground, staring at the Scarecrow's arm. She told him to quit messing around. "The joke's over, Ollie." Still, he didn't say anything. I asked him, "What's wrong?" He looked up at me, and I swear, Ben lad, that he never had the same eyes after that day. His eyes were so small, so scared. Me and Rose looked down at the arm, and there weren't straw in there, Ben. There were a bone, a human bone, and dry, dead skin. Ben felt his heart plummet into his stomach. He thought of the mummified cat in the walls, the dried, desiccated skin, the taut bones, the filthy rags, and the patchy, wasted strands of hair. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. How could that happen? To a person? How could that never be noticed? And yet he knew from experience just how easy it was. for things to slip away from the living world, to lie undiscovered in untrampled corners. Jake looked exhausted, like the sheer effort of recounting the affair had drained his soul. All of us screamed and we ran as fast as we could out of the field, over the fence, and then we were piddling like hell back across the wheat fields, back to our parents' place. We flung our bikes onto the ground and we bolted inside, all of us crying in bits. We told our parents, and of course they told us off for telling lies, gave us a smack, but all three of us insisted. And they must have believed us, because I remember Dad going to make a phone call while Mum put me and Ollie to bed and then marched Rose back to her grandparents. Oh, she was crying, Rose was. That kind of quiet crying you do when you just can't stop. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept imagining that she was there, Sally Wheatley, in the corner of my room, waiting to jump out and get me with that horrible cackle. Our parents kept us in for the rest of the week, until it were time to go back to school. The police came round the next day. I thought I were going to be arrested, but bless them, they were nice as anything. Just asked us a few questions, what had happened in the field, how we'd found the Scarecrow. Ollie were hanging his head, and I'd never seen him like that. Ashamed. He just kept saying how sorry he was, how he didn't mean to cause all this trouble. They patted him on his head and they left. It was later that day that he apologised, really said sorry to me, and I could tell even then that he meant it, more than he'd meant anything before in his life. We didn't hear anything else until we went back to school, and that was when we were able to see Rose again, and we asked her, what happened? What did your granddad say? God, Ben, she looked worse than the two of us. Haunted like. And she just hands us that day's newspaper. Don't think I kept a clipping, but I remember what it said. The police had taken down the Scarecrow in Sally Black. Must have thought it was a murder victim some sick bastard had strung up in the field. This was when the Yorkshire Ripper was about, mind you. But they soon figured out that it was old. Very old. They'd brought in archaeologists, the paper said, and they thought that the body must have been there about 300 years. That Scarecrow, the mummy, it had been in that field since the 17th century. The sky outside was completely black now, the orange haze of streetlights casting Hexham Abbey's crenellations into sharp relief. Was it her? Ben asked, his voice flat and hoarse. The body in the field. Was it Sally Wheatley? Jake sighed and rubbed his chin. He looked exhausted. They never said. Not enough evidence, I suppose. After they did all the tests, they buried her in the abbey, just over there. He pointed out the window at the bulk of the church, and Ben looked out with a renewed sense of dread that this nightmare thing had been so close all along. They called her an unknown Hexham woman on the slab. But the town gossips, of course they do, and all the kids knew that it was Sally. That's what they had meant in the story. When they said she'd been trussed up in that field, they hadn't hung her like the miller's son. They'd tied her to that post and left her. Just left her to wither and die. Because that's what the archaeologists had found when they'd examined that body. She hadn't been hung, hadn't had her neck broken. She'd starved to death. Ben gasped, an exhalation of fright as his stomach churned. He thought of the cat again, trapped in the walls of the farmhouse, mewling and shrieking as it wasted away. The thought of that happening to a person, of their wails going unanswered as they drifted across the endless fields of Sunnyside, was too dreadful to contemplate. Horrible, Ben whispered, tears pricking his eyes. That's horrible. Jake reached out his hand and rubbed Ben's shoulder. I'm sorry, lad. Really, I am. It's why we never wanted you to know.
We couldn't spoil it for you, Sunnyside, like it was spoiled for us. That was what I loved about watching you grow up, Ben. Racing about those fields with your mates like we used to. Better that you never knew. Never had to dream of that field of air. Because I do dream of air. All three of us did. We were never quite alone after that day. Whenever we were out in the fields, there'd always be this speck. This little black speck bobbing around in the corner of our eyes, like a head. Someone hiding among the grass. And when we look, it'd be gone. We all grew up. Ollie and Rose got married, and it would always be just as we were about to forget it and move on. That's when we'd see it again, coming toward us over the horizon. We all had our own ways of dealing with it. Rose, she ignores it, never gives it the time of day. Me? That's why I moved out here, to the town. Can't sneak up on me here, can she? Not when her body is so close. And Ollie...
Jake trailed off, and that desolate, haunted look came over him. And Ben knew what was coming next. The final closing of the loop of that all-consuming disaster that had defined his life since before he was born. The accident, Ben said blankly. Jake was crying now, all the trauma bubbling to the surface. He wrapped his arms around himself, rocking back and forth like a child.
He could never let it go,
he moaned.
Ollie, he could never just leave it alone. He had to go back, didn't he? When they were putting the pylons in at Sally Black, he just had to go back. I don't know why, even now. Maybe he wanted to show he wasn't scared, to himself, to Sally, but she got him. She'll get us all in the end, somehow. There was no reason, Ben. No reason for Ollie to climb over that fence, to be holding on to those wires. She made him do it. Or the thought of her made him do it, I know it. I tried to stop him, I tried. I'm so sorry, Ben, my lad. It was so horrible. I'm so sorry.
Ben's phone buzzed with a notification, and the two of them jumped. Ben looked down and saw that it was nearly 9 o'clock at night.
It's Mum,
he said, wiping his face and trying to regain his composure.
She'll be wondering where I am. Even now, she worries.
He wasn't sure if Jake had heard him. He was staring at the ground, weeping bitter tears. He was muttering under his breath.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, Sally. They made me do it. I'm sorry. Don't get me, Sally, please. Leave me alone, Sally.
Ben flicked open his phone and opened the message from Rose, ready to apologise for losing track of time, to tell her that he was coming straight back home and that he loved her. But then he read the message, and he felt his heart fall out of his chest and his brain fry, and the infrasound hum of the electric light overhead bury its way into his bones so that he no longer knew whether he was dreaming or mad or if all of this was so horribly real. A single, blurry photograph sat open in the chat. It must have been shot from the upstairs window of his old bedroom. Ben recognised the angle. The fields stretching off across the horizon. The pylons silhouetted black against the moonlit sky, like they had been in that dream, where they'd marched across the fields and reached out their long metallic fingers to grab him. Between the edge of the field and the house lay the prone figure of the young Labrador. It was on its side, and even in the motion-blurred image, Ben could see that it was dead. Crouching over the dog, staring up at the window where the photo had been snapped, was a figure. A dreadful, coal-black, stick-thin figure. Tattered rags draped across protruding ribs. Long, matted strands of hair lying lank across the skeletal face. the thin white line of its mouth pulled back in a warped, stretched cackle of laughter. Below the photograph was a message, blank and flat, and Ben knew he would never see his mother alive again.
Shouldn't have taken it out. Love you, pet,
Rose had written. Sally Wheatley was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod. The script editor was Jennifer Rhiann Bartley. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new original story on the 29th of July. Thank you for listening. May we meet again.